Welcome to Cyber Focus, your source of international business news. I'm Sarah Reeves, and with me today is Professor Mary Embry, faculty with the IU College of Arts and Sciences, Department of Apparel Merchandising and Interior Design. Welcome, Professor Embry.
Thank you for having me.
So today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the global textile industry. With the recent tragedy in Bangladesh, it's kind of been in the news recently, and I was just hoping you could share with us why what happened in Bangladesh is relevant to us in the U.S.
Absolutely. The collapse of the Rana Plaza factory in Bangladesh is being named as one of the world's worst apparel industry disasters. But this collapse is on the heels of many problems, given its health or fire or safety violations that have happened since 2000 and earlier in Bangladesh. Mm-hmm. In 2000, we also had a fire in the Chaudhry knitwear factory where over 100 people perished. And every year we see something coming out of the industry. So there's been a regular problems with the Bangladeshi industry, but you have to realize that the garment industry in Bangladesh is very critical to their economy. Mm-hmm. That it's 16% of their gross domestic product.
That's quite
it
big.
Is 80% of the exports that they send out. So they are dependent on garments. It employs 4 million people, and 80% of those people are women. But that industry exists to serve the consumption of the U.S. and the European Union. Mm-hmm. The United States, every man, woman, and child consumes per year over $900 in clothing on average. That equals about 62 garments that we bring into our houses, each person that lives in that house every year. We are the world's largest apparel importer. And as a result of that consumer demand, we have huge consolidated retailers like Target and Walmart and Sears and H&M that are able to source from places like Bangladesh. What's been interesting about the response to Bangladesh is that retailers were instantly questioned after the disaster. The brands that contracted the manufacturing were asked about their responsibility, and that may show the globalization of the apparel industry best, where you had these local conditions where you had bad decisions made by factory owners, you had lack of government oversight, but at the same time, as those questions are being asked, we're saying, so what are the people that benefit the most from this relationship? What is their response going to be to these conditions? So asking, what was your role, retailer? How much product were you getting out of there? What do you plan to do for the workers that had family members die? And how can we prevent this in the future? And these are all really good questions to be asking, linking those that sell and consume product to those that make the product and what their responses are. I think the frustration in the industry is that these conditions persist over time. Health and safety has been a concern in the apparel industry ever since we started outsourcing in Bangladesh for over a decade.
Well, and I can remember Nike and the conditions in their factories was quite big news many years ago.
Right.
And so it's not something that's just new.
Right. We keep asking these questions in different contexts, and I think finding solutions is going to involve not just the answer from one stakeholder. It's going to have to be a coordinated response. The collapse, what's interesting about the collapse is that beforehand there was a story in local media about the structural safety of that building. And everybody ignored that story, not just retailers, not just buyers, but the factory owners, the government, the activists that were all involved and invested in what was happening in Bangladesh, all ignored what was happening.
So from a U.S. perspective, can you help us understand the scope of the market of textiles that are being made outside of the U.S.? Are most of my clothes being made overseas?
think if you look in your closet, you would be hard-pressed to find a label that says made in the USA, except if you have a brand that's strategically sourcing or making product like American Apparel in the USA and talking about it in their branding. Most of the product you buy from specialty and mass merchandisers is coming from overseas. Especially if that product is price competitive, you can pretty much guarantee that it's coming from a low-income country. What's interesting about your labels, though, is that labels define where a product was sewn together. And so there could be all kinds of content that comes into that, the fiber, the yarn, the textile, that isn't being labeled as to their country of origin, because textiles don't have any value for the consumer unless you're a sewer. You can't wear a textile. And so when you add the value of it being apparel, that defines where that piece of apparel was born. And so your labels are just giving us one facet of the garment. So there's more lack of transparency in the textile industry. You could have U.S. content, U.S. value added in that product, but we wouldn't know from looking at the label. But most of our apparel is being constructed overseas. If we look at what we call import penetration ratios, our apparel in the United States is 97.7% imports.
That's surprising.
Yes, it is. And over 33% of that is from China alone. So one third of it.
I know in preparation for this conversation, I was looking at my labels as I was putting the laundry away and determining that most of my clothes say China on them.
Right.
And then a couple of other areas, Sri Lanka, but mostly China. Yeah.
You'll see a lot of labels from export-dependent countries who primarily their economies are dependent on apparel. So you'll see Cambodia, which has similar problems that we see in the Bangladeshi industry. Bangladesh, Cambodia, Sri Lanka to some degree is dependent on apparel exports. And Vietnam does a lot of apparel exports but are less dependent on it because they still work in agriculture a lot. But for textiles, there's still highly skilled workers working in textiles in the United States, but more than 80% of those textiles are exported overseas, and most of those go to China. We're the number one. I know we're swapping value. The number one, our number one cotton exporter is China, where China's number 2 for yarns and number 3 for textiles. And so we're still sending a lot of textiles overseas that could show up in your wardrobe somewhere. Footwear also is a category that's even a little higher. 98% of our footwear comes from overseas. We think of places like Indonesia where that's being made. And even though you'll hear about there being jobs in the footwear industry, and some brands have strategically started talking about U.S. jobs in footwear, like we saw car companies start talking about car jobs in footwear. Still, that's primarily an overseas industry also. There, interesting too, is a law that federal agencies have to get 51% of their product from the U.S., their apparel product.
Interesting.
So there's always been since we started forming this country, national security interests in having manufacturing capability for textiles and apparel. But what's most interesting about that is that some of that has been outsourced to prison labor. So even within the United States, we look for cheapest labor when we're sewing apparel together.
And so you were saying that it's been a national security interest, but how is it that it happened that so much of our garments and textiles were being produced overseas then, if it was an issue of importance to the country since the beginning? Right.
It's the nature of apparel. It's a labor-intensive industry. When you sew apparel together, out of the final retail cost of a product, it may just show up to be 6%. But when we look at manufacturing costs, it's 15 to 20% of the cost of making that item. So labor costs are important. And when U.S. wages are looking in the $8 to $14 range without benefits, you make comparisons to Bangladesh, where wages have been like 21 cents an hour, places like Cambodia where they're 23 cents an hour, Vietnam where it's 36 cents an hour. There's no comparison. Our top suppliers do correlate with the lowest wages that exist in the globe. In addition to being labor intensive, clothing is also a low skill operation, and so it can absorb masses of uneducated labor, people that have no other opportunities. So it tends to do that. When you're looking at jeans, we can specialize jeans into 30 separate operations. And so one person sews a side seam, one person specializes in putting in a waistband over and over, day after day, buttonholes, zippers, cutting threads, quality control at the end.
Wow.
And so we've commoditized the workers' functions in producing those jeans in order to make them at a mass scale for U.S. and European markets, but also to make them very productively and very efficiently. They're, in addition to apparel finding low labor costs around the world, the textile industry is criticized for looking for lower environmental standards in addition to labor costs. And so Greenpeace has done a lot of work at looking at places with concentrated textile factories that sell to US and European brands and seeing what kind of effluent is coming out of those factories and doing reports to raise the awareness of the environmental controls of those industries. But it was primarily in the 90s when mass production of retail moved offshore. And we saw in the middle of the 90s, a t-shirt could wholesale for $2.50. And then just in 2000, just 5 years later, it was costing $1.35.
Wow.
And so the price dropped during the 90s and we started buying a lot of t-shirts. And you can see the correlation with this and fast fashion becoming more popular to speed up the fashion cycle to consumers certainly benefit from the industry moving overseas. But what happened is companies separated their branding and design, these very high value added activities, kept those in the United States, and then de-invested from manufacturing. And it started to move and be invested in by low income countries around the world. And that's the least profitable part of the supply chain. And so manufacturing now is contracted and subcontracted in hundreds and thousands of factories around the world, to the point where brands can't even define where they're making product. And the goal is to start to define that better. H&M manufactures in 1,800 factories around the world and doesn't own one of them.
That's a lot of factories.
It is. And we're still waiting on 40 brands to confirm whether they did have product that was being made in the factory collapse in Bangladesh.
They don't know.
Because they don't know.
So H&M has 1,800 factories, and you're saying there's hundreds of thousands of factories. So is this incident in Bangladesh an anomaly? Is normally this global web of supply chain a relatively safe environment, or is this the norm actually overseas?
Yeah, I think it's a yes and no. I think Bangladesh is a special case, as less infrastructure maybe than other areas. The safety inspection mechanisms in Bangladesh are notoriously poor. They have 18 inspectors to look over 100,000 factories in Dhaka, with the budget like 1/8 the size of New York City. So it's just no resources.
Yeah.
So they've essentially outsourced the looking over of factories to the retailers themselves, because they obviously don't have the resources to do it. So manufacturing in resource poor areas do create these extra concerns that we have to define who's looking over the problems that could exist. The factory in Bangladesh was actually audited by an organization called the Business Social Compliance Initiative. But that audit didn't look at the structural viability of the building. So we have to go back and say, well, who's looking over structural viability of the building? Does this need to be on some kind of auditing report? So the question is, who is doing what in some places? When we look at places like Cambodia, just as a comparison, which is also export dependent on garments, and sell most of that exporting to the US and the European Union, they also have had the same kinds of problems recently too, getting news where they've had 2 building collapses in the month of May. Not as dramatic, not as many lives lost, but still the same kind of conditions.
Yeah.
And we have inspectors in there doing ad hoc looks at factories, and the reports that are coming out is a look at 100 factories reveals 25 health and safety violations. So still too high of numbers for, I think, retailers and consumers to really be comfortable with. One of the factory collapses was linked to H&M product, but H&M didn't know it was manufacturing there. Another factory collapse was linked to product being made by a well-known shoe brand, Western shoe brand. And that factory was looked over by the International Labor Organization under their Better Factories Cambodia program. So it was supposed to be a factory that was okay to manufacture from, and we still see problems in it. So what's the good story here is that after 2 decades, we have something happening. 2 decades ago, retailers wouldn't have been able to answer questions about what was being made and what the conditions were like. We had no idea what the conditions of factories were. We didn't have any data. We weren't using data to make assessments. But after years of worker and consumer activism on this point in particular, the debate has shifted. And a number of companies that are forward-leaning have well-developed CSR programs looking into these issues, and a number of those are really using those programs to empower workers. I think large apparel manufacturers look at a portion of their supply chain and look at the working conditions that are there, especially in the what we call cut, make, trim, or sewing factories, garment construction factories. But we still have no idea about the earlier phases, what we call upstream activities of textile factories, or those that are subcontracted. It's just like the first tier of contracting that we're looking at. And we certainly have agencies looking at the worst ills of the apparel industry, which is forced and child labor. That happens mainly in the textile industry. We have 16 countries around the world where we know forced and child labor is happening, and many of those are heavily invested in textiles. So places like Uzbekistan and Brazil and Pakistan are places where child and forced labor is happening in the textile industry that are at risk for not being transparent.
So what options are there out there for U.S. businesses to help address this issue? And I'm imagining that it might be different for a big brand or retailer versus, your smaller, maybe local stores. And so what can they do when they're looking at these kinds of issues?
There is a difference between small retailers and large retailers. Large retailers have to move back and look at how they build systems into buying practices that they have, how they collect the data from monitoring reports, and how it's being used to assess and improve. And we'd like to see over time that data become public and more transparent so that consumers can use it, that we can use it in collective ways, that we can kind of all move ahead together to understand what the industry entails right now, what it looks like right now, and what we want it to look like. Smaller retailers, it's harder in that the costs are different for ethical items. They're more expensive. You have to do some research, but also the consumer can talk to smaller retailers about where are you getting your product, what choices are you making about what product you're selling. those kinds of questions that have more local context. But I think that the challenges are different, and it has to do with scale. We'd like to see the larger companies be the leaders, of course. But when we look at innovation, it's happening, in small pieces in larger companies, but we have new companies that are being formed in response to this that have strategic missions to have ethical apparel written into the way that they function their business. And so those are the kind of next tier of exciting advancements, is that we can bring innovation to this and make it more of a public conversation. There's an organization called the Sustainable Apparel Coalition that's developing something called the Higgs Index. And this index rates the ethical properties, the social environmental properties of individual products.
Interesting.
So retailers can use this to wrap their heads around what their products mean, but also it could become a consumer-facing label. And so we want to see these civic arrangements that involve lots of brands that are multi-stakeholder, that have bigger implications, rather than proprietary reactions that are hidden in the industry.
And as a consumer, then, is my main power in this voting with my dollars, basically? Is I choose what I'm purchasing, and that's how I can affect the market?
Yes, I mean, I think that's the way to do it. The high bar standards are fair trade and organic. They're looking for to look at social environmental impact and to set standards for it in how product is made. But it's not always a realistic choice for all consumers. People have certainly drawn correlations between the exportation of bad working standards that make product that serves the cheap end of our market, that also is importing bad working conditions into the U.S., that there's a relationship between all of these things. So not everybody has the luxury right now of choosing ethical items. The idea is to build awareness and make small choices, or make conversations with retailers around, do you know where your product is coming from? I would prefer that it came from supporting a woman's job rather than endangering her life.
Professor Embry, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing about this current event topic. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. I was glad to be here.
Excellent.
Thank you.
If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future cyber focuses, you can reach us at ciber@indiana.edu. Thank you.